Oh snap, Italians gonna hate this channel. They'll be alright, they'll deal with it. Anyway, welcome back to the channel, this tactical intellectual channel. We're going to discuss the primitive population of Italy. Not what you think, it's going to be the early inhabitants of the Italian peninsula, the melanated portion that history pretty much forgot about. Actually, history did not forget about it. It's the people that write the history. Hint, hint. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it.
So right now on the screen, I'm showing that keynote slide, and these are the sources shaping my opinions regarding the Italian peninsula and the original inhabitants, that people, that part of the world right there. And here's the source material: Racial History of Man, The Races of Europe, Sex and Race, Volume 1. We're gonna go into Sex and Race, Volume 1 to just start everything off and set the tone. Then we're gonna go into the other sources right here. So Sex and Race, Volume 1, chapters 8 and 15. I'm gonna read and then do my little reaction a little bit on what I just read, and then gonna move on and until we complete this entire video presentation. All right.
Chapter 8 with the title Negroes in Ancient Rome and Carthage. It reads, the earliest known natives of Italy were Negroes, as was said, thus making the base of the Latin race Negroid. Dr. Wilson, basing his observations on the earliest Etruscan pottery, refers to well-known examples of Etruscan vases molded in the forms of Negroes' heads, and of Greek pottery painted with the same characteristic features and woolly hair. Specimens of both are preserved among the collections of the British Museum and furnish interesting evidence alike of the permanency of the Negro type and of the familiarity both of the Greek and Etruscan artists with the African features long prior to the Christian era. As regards race mixing in Rome, Juvenal, Martial, and other writers were cited in chapter 1. An oration by the noted orator Calpurnius Flaccus of that time was also mentioned. Judging from the interest manifested, miscegenation, or more precisely speaking, adulterous unions with Negroes must have been fairly common. Rome, like Egypt and Greece, had no color distinctions. Her extensive literature reveals none. Rome's attempts at a color line begins with Mussolini thousands of years later. Peoples of all races and colors were brought to Rome from her far-flung provinces: Sudanese, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Moors, Greeks, Parthians, Gauls, Celts, Belgians, Saxons, Britons, and thrown into a vast melting pot. We find proof of the absence of color prejudice in the word Niger or Niger. Like Ethiop, it crept into the Roman language, having been brought there from Africa. The word comes from the river Niger, and Negrite means the people from the river Niger. Ni probably means grace, and Ger or Gier is African for river. At first, the Ger had nothing more to do with black, and the waters of the river itself, Ater, was the Latin for black. Some of the most illustrious Romans bore the surname Niger or Negro, as Pescennius Niger, one of their greatest emperors. Another Niger was counselor to the royal family and accompanied Octavia, sister of Caesar or Caesar Augustus, to Greece when she went there to try to win back her husband Mark Antony from Cleopatra. A later Niger was Henry III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who married the daughter of Canute, King of England. All right, we'll stop there. All right, so with chapter 8, I can find it kind of satisfactory. The piece of information that
I read in the first sentence where it says that the earliest known natives of Italy were Negroes. And I mean, how can I quantify that? How can I back it up? Well, this right here, the Sex and Race Volume 1, Chapter 8, that was just to get your appetite whet. The main course is definitely Racial History of Man by Roland and Dixon. We're gonna go and see what that has to say in regards to, I guess, the skeletal remains and the early migrations and settlement to the Italian peninsula. So let's go ahead and check that out. So we're in chapter 5, page 139. In the highlighted portion, it says the racial history of Italy does not begin with any certainty until Neolithic times. In France and other portions of Western Europe, we have what are, after all, not inconsiderable remains from the Paleolithic period, but although the climatic and other environmental factors in the Italian peninsula, then joined to northern Africa by way of Sicily, would seem to have been at least as favorable for human occupation as in southern France. Almost no skeletal remains of unquestioned Paleolithic age have as yet been found. The much discussed Olmo skull discovered near Arezzo in Tuscany would establish the presence in Italy at that time of a people characterized by the possession of a low dolichocephalic skull. Whether this represents the Proto-Australoid or the Mediterranean type is uncertain, owing to the absence of nasal bones. Alright, so the main takeaway when it comes to page 139, the time period, that's basically what I want right there. We have Neolithic times and Paleolithic times. And then also the little tidbit of information, the Italian peninsula back then was joined to northern Africa by way of Sicily. So that is something that's pretty much noteworthy right there. So let's move on to page 140. All right, so page 140, the highlighted portion reads, judging from the very complete crania, however, it appears that two dolichocephalic types are present, the Mediterranean and the Proto-Negroid, the latter at least of very short stature. The Proto-Negroid type was, it may be remembered, found in Paleolithic times in the Grimaldi caves near the French-Italian border. So that its persistence in northern Italy is not surprising. The brachycephalic factors were also two, the Alpine and the Mongoloid. Drop down a little bit. These indicate that although the population of the eastern portion of Sicily was predominantly dolichocephalic, there was also a small element of brachycephalic type. If the two sexes are separated, a rather striking difference between them at once appears. For whereas the males show a strong predominance of dolichocephalic factors, the females have no actual dolichocephals at all, and instead a large majority of brachycephalic factors. Analysis of the measurements indicate that the long-headed elements among the males are in the first place the Mediterranean, followed by the Proto-Australoid. So let's drop down a little bit. At the end of the Neolithic period, the fundamental stratum of the population in the Italian peninsula and the islands was composed primarily of the Mediterranean type, with some survival of the older Proto-Australoid and the Proto-Negroid types presumably present in Paleolithic times. Into this predominantly dolichocephalic population came, as into most of Europe at this time, an infiltration of brachycephalic peoples which profoundly influenced the situation not only on the mainland but in the islands as well. So let's go ahead and go to 142. The highlighted portion reads, the former stream would have
brought large increments of brachycephalic, primarily alpine peoples, the latter probably a mixed group. The result, at any rate, was that by the end of the Bronze period, the population of the Po Valley and Venetia was much more strongly brachycephalic than before. Drop down. With the beginning of the historic period, we are on firmer grounds, and the first of the problems that calls for discussion is the much debated one of the racial character and affiliations of the Etruscans, whose civilization in the valley of the Po and in Tuscany antedated that of Rome. Analysis of the series about 100 crania which are available shows at once that they form a very much mixed group. In both sexes, the Mediterranean type is the most important single factor, followed by the Palealpine and Alpine types. So going to page 143, the highlighted portion reads, if Mosso is correct, however, in his dating of the crania, it would seem to be undeniable that the early Etruscans were very notably more dolichocephalic than the latter, and belonged, moreover, primarily to the Caspian and Proto-Negroid types, rather than to the Mediterranean, which was dominant in Italy in earlier times. The early Etruscans, therefore, were to a considerable extent un-Italian, and their traditional foreign origin is thus corroborated, although but little light is thrown on the vexed question of their provenience, since they seem, however, to have been in large part dolichocephalic. Any close relationship, such as has been suggested, to the highly brachycephalic population of Asia Minor seems impossible. If the Etruscans were a mixed people, what can be said of their neighbors to the south in Latium, that Latin people who were destined to conquer the Etruscans and build up the great power of Rome? This series of Roman crania of the 6th century BC is the earliest data we possess, and shows that the Romans of that period, prior to the establishment of the Republic, were almost as mixed a people as the Etruscans. Alright, so I'm going to be short and sweet when it comes to giving my commentary with what I just read. Well, we know that it's talking about, basically the gist of it is they're mixed people. The skeletal remains, there's many different types of people. We already went over the Wessia type, and we see there's a lot of Negro people there. So, I mean, Mediterranean, Alpine, Australoid, Negroid, I mean, those are all Negro peoples, and we see that when it comes to the Etruscan population. It says on page 143 that to a considerable extent they were un-Italian, and their traditional foreign origin, I mean, it's just, it's a mystery to these people. And then, okay, the people of Latium, just like the Etruscans, were a mixed people. So let's resume and go to page 144, and we're going to read from the highlighted portion. It says, the old Neolithic dolichocephalic peoples, mainly of Mediterranean and Proto-Australoid types, had been overlaid by the largely blended with Palealpine and Alpine peoples who had come into the Po Valley from the north, and also bringing with them the Terra Mare culture around the head of the Adriatic from the Balkan region. Okay, so that's more mixtures right there, naturally. So I want to see if the information harmonize. So let's go to the place of the Welsh in the history of Britain by Boyd Dawkins, and on page 18, let's check out where it says the same distribution. The same distribution of people is also met with on the French side of the Pyrenees, the Iberian being in the west and the Celt in the east, and a mixed race being sandwiched between them, resulting from their intermarriage. It is obvious, therefore, that those tall invaders of the lands on the west side of the Rhine are either identical with the Celts or Gauls of history, or, to say the least, so closely related to them in tongue or speech and physique as to leave no mark behind by which they can be distinguished. They were the vanguard of the great Aryan army which ultimately conquered the whole of Western Europe. They belonged to the race that turned the Etruscans out of the region of northern Italy and seized the whole of the valley of the Po at the beginning of the 4th century before Christ, who a little later nearly destroyed the Roman power and who offered a fierce resistance in Gaul to Caesar or Kaiser in the middle of the 1st century before the Christian era. Okay, they are described by Roman writers as tall, with light hair and light complexion, and with fierce blue eyes. Okay, so that's all for today when it comes to that information. We're going to definitely revisit that as we start discussing later timelines and later invasions, but that's an important marriage of information there. These sources, they say the same thing, so we can reach a certain conclusion. All right, so let's go to the book Environment, Race, and Migration by Griffith Taylor. Starting on page 178, the highlighted portion, it reads, "All around the western margin are the very narrow-headed Mediterranean folk. These form the lowest stratum, and it still persists in Scandinavia, southwest France, Portugal, in parts of Italy." Okay, that's what we need. So let's drop down a little bit. Next comes the Nordic zone, most prominent around the Baltic and northern seas. The great central wedge of alpine peoples is connected with the central peoples of Asia, though the common practice of separating Europe from Asia has hidden the close continuity. The main body of alpine peoples are of moderate stature, rather dark, with brown or black hair, and so let's drop down a little bit. They constitute the South Germans, Austrians, Eastern French, Northern Italians. Okay, so that's the point there. So that definitely links with other sources that say the same thing. So, I mean, that comparative research is very necessary when it comes to searching for truth rather than living by fiction. So we approach the end of this Italian Peninsula video presentation, but we have a lot of information for the part 2s, 3s, 4s of this video series. Like, we're going to utilize a lot of Dr. Maria Charles, her literary works, books and magazines. Definitely the video interviews. I'm going to make use of all of them that I have. And we have a book by Tansy Ward called Hidden Legacies, African Presence in European Antiques. We're going to use that. Nature Knows No Color Line. We're going to check that out, and that's by J.A. Rogers. We're going to really do a deep dive on all of that stuff here. I also have a 3-volume set of the image of the Black in Western art. So the part that pertains to the Italian Peninsula, I'm definitely going to show information, show the imagery, and then what it means, information behind it. So stay tuned for that.